much, Tricia, for your very kind introduction. It's fantastic to be here at the ACMS Speaker Series. When I was here in 2014 and 2015, I attended a few of the speaker series during my field work. And so it's a real privilege to be on this side of the podium a few years later, now that I've got something actually to tell you. A few years ago, I was still figuring out my thesis. So it is a privilege to be here, especially to be in an audience that cares passionately about Mongolia's future and development. Whenever I speak in academic conferences abroad, often I have to go into quite a lot of detail to explain the unique specificity of the Mongolian context. And here it's so delightful because that's everyone's concern. That's why you're all here, and you all know a lot about Mongolia. What I will say today is that my perspective today is probably not going to tell you much new in terms of facts. So I'm going to be re-narrating the legal politics of Mongolia's mining regime. So in some senses, you're probably, if you've lived here over the past 20 odd years, you're probably deeply familiar with those politics in a way that even I'm not, having come back and forth. So I'm conscious that I'm presenting as an outsider perspective, even though I have spent quite a lot of time in Mongolia in the past. So I hope that I'm really interested to hear your comments and your feedback after my presentation. So the reason I titled my presentation with the provocative statement, "The state has forgotten its reason for being," is because that is a quote from one of my interviews in 2015 with a leader of the Ongi River movement, who has now sadly passed away, but he was talking about the changing rationale for the state in relation to mining and the way that he felt that the state had abandoned its commitments to its citizens in terms of protecting them from social and environmental impacts of mining. However, I can equally imagine a critic of the government's resource nationalist politics saying the same thing around the same time, that the state had forgotten that it needed to facilitate a market-led development strategy. So I put the question mark there because I want to engage with that deeper question about what is the function and the role of the state and how is it impacted by extractive development. So Tricia's already really given a very kind introduction, so I'm not going to belabor my own details. So I lecture in constitutional law at Montfort University. My research interests are really about how does globalizing an economy affect public institutions. So we often have this assumption that integrating into the global markets means that the state doesn't have any impact really on the state. The state can retain its national democratic constitutional structure, even though its economy is becoming exposed to global dynamics. And what I want to argue is that that empirically isn't true. So in the pursuit of global extractive development, we can see a real change in the way the state is organized and in the particular politics that the state is or is not pursuing. So today's presentation is based on research that I've conducted largely since 2012. My research project is much bigger than what I'm going to talk about today. I'm giving you a small snapshot into a much bigger project. And if you're interested to read more, Routledge is publishing my book later this year, and the title is Transnational Law and State Transformation, The Case of Extractive Development in Mongolia. So obviously this will be available online, but if any of you want to get in touch with me after the seminar, I'd be happy to share the book with you when it comes out, and to make it available as well to, if it's not accessible here in libraries, to make it available. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is a threefold task. So I'm going to set out a conceptual framework for why we should connect questions of economic development with questions about the state and why that makes sense to do so. I'm going to also introduce a socio-legal perspective. So why am I focusing on changes in Mongolia's legal regime governing mining? As a socio-legal scholar, I believe that changes in the law reflect much more dynamic social processes. So politics, power relations, the way that law constructs relationships between the state and the citizen, as well as the state and the private sector. And so I'm going to advocate for an attentiveness to legal dynamics as an insight into the relationship between economic development and the state. And finally, I'm going to be talking quite concretely in terms of key changes that have occurred in Mongolia's mining regime, the way the mining sector is regulated over the last 20 odd years or so. Okay, important to give a few key terms. So you might say my title was packed with key terms. I just want to note, you're probably all aware of this, when I talk about extractive development, I'm referring to a strategy that is at least intended on paper to improve collective wealth, welfare, and well-being through the extraction of natural resources. So this is what extractive development says on the package. This is what it's about. And so I'm going to take it at face value, and then we're going to see how it measures up. Socio-legal analysis, as I said before, is about understanding the law in its social context. So when I talk about Mongolia's mining regime, I'm interested in the text, so the mining laws, the investment laws, the environmental laws that give shape to the regulatory structure. But I'm also interested in the social context which produce those laws and the kind of norms and values that those laws protect and promote. Defining the state is probably the trickiest definition. Reams of academic literature have focused on how to define the state. What is it? We seem to know intuitively when we talk about the state, but if you actually talk to someone and said, what is the state? You'd get a wealth of different responses. So I like to define the state rather sociologically. It's difficult to say exactly what the state is in its being. We can't kind of point and say, oh, there's the state. We can point to parliament, we can point to government ministries and agencies, we can point to the courts. But at the same time, there is a totality that altogether they represent a way of governing in a particular territory. So the state is always about governing a people in a place, and it's about the ensemble of judicial, political, and regulatory institutions that make up that totality. I like the idea of an ensemble because it means we can also break it apart. So I've given you an image here of an orchestra where you can think about, okay, where are the flute players and the wind instruments and the string instruments and the percussion? And if we think about that in terms of state institutions and capacities, it helps us to be able to say, we can think about it as a whole, but we need to deconstruct the specificity of the elements we're talking about. A socio-legal analysis of state transformation, then, is concerned with how institutions and laws change on paper as well as on practice. So factors which need to be taken into consideration in terms of the wider social context are related to questions about, what is the economic base of a society or in a territory? How is the state coordinating production? What is the relationship between the state and the people in that place? Is it a democratic state? Is it an authoritarian state? What are the relationships between the governed and the governing? Also, what are the relationships with other states? So we can't think about states in isolation. States are always formed in relation to international dynamics. In Mongolia, this is particularly true in the sense that Mongolia's independence came about as a result of, at least as far as I understand it, of a desire to avoid further colonization by the Chinese, and also to associate with Russia through calling the Red Army to secure its borders. So in that sense, the formation of the Mongolian People's Republic was very much born out of a particular geopolitical conflict at the beginning of the 20th century. And we could still say today that state transformation, we can't talk about that independently of wider geopolitical factors. And finally, we need to think about the values, ideas, and norms about governance that inform how states change. Okay, so to go back to the ensemble metaphor, it enables us to ask questions about why do some parts of the state ensemble, these different regulatory, judicial, and political institutions, why do they start playing a different tune at a different time? What happens when one part of the ensemble is singing a particular melody and the other part is using different instruments to different audiences? So in some ways I'm stretching the metaphor here, but what I'm trying to get at is how do we think about how institutions of the state recalibrate their relationship with each other and with external actors. Okay, so now that I've discussed the definitions, I'm going to move on to just establishing in quite basic terms why economic development is a catalyst for state transformation. So states rely on two critical variables to maintain their legitimacy. One of them is having a strong economic base. So states need to have control over wealth and accumulation in order to legitimize itself as an authority in a particular place. So historically, we can see when we look at the historicity of the modern state, it's been about consolidating state control over processes of accumulation. So at a very practical level, whenever there's a shift in economic development strategy in a state, we can say that that has something to do with how the state is organized. Because economic development strategies don't just are produced in some economic ether. They actually require a lot of political and legal coordination to make them happen. So at a very practical level, the state is inherently involved when we have a change in strategy. Equally, political issues of legitimation are always thrown up. So because the state is constituted by a relationship with the people in a place, the state needs to make sure that people are on board with the strategy. So there's a sense in which the state isn't able to do what it wants in isolation. Even authoritarian states, to some degree, need to make sure that the population doesn't subtly undermine or resist the strategy, that there's not a coup d'etat or an outright rebellion. There needs to be some kind of legitimation. This is particularly the case in democracies, right? Because there's a very clear mechanism for changing governments. It's very easy for the state to pick up when there are legitimacy gaps that they're not addressing. So, to make it very simple, we can say that there is a simple equation. Two key legitimacy variables for the state is how they manage and control accumulation processes, and how they gather public or maintain general public support, or at least make sure that the resistance isn't too high. The reason why this is important is because it means that economic development is inherently connected to these two axes which provoke the state, and provoke kind of the heart of the state, if you will. Basically money and approval. So now what I want to argue today is that extractive development strategies out of economic development strategies in general are particularly prone to this state transformative potential because it hits both variables in a very potent way. So it changes how the state accumulates revenue. So instead of being based on taxation, we have a shift to the state accumulating revenue based on mineral rents. So if the state had previously been primarily dependent on taxation, that also reinforces the link between the citizen and the state. When the state becomes dependent on mineral rents, that changes the relationship between the citizen and the state, and it means that there's a close interdependent relationship then on the developers and the state. Equally, in terms of legitimacy, extractive development has unique potential to spark dissent, social concern, because it has very concrete impacts on social and environmental spaces, as well as ripple effects in terms of the economy. So in that sense, economic development strategies are really loaded in terms of their state transforming potential. Now, this is even more so in the context of the global economy. So you could say that in a nationalized extractive development strategy, the state can kind of contain some of those legitimacy impacts because it's in control of the sector. Now, that changes when we get to economic globalization. So since the 1980s, most economic sectors in countries have become highly internationalized. And what that means is that the barriers around national economies have been broken down. And so tariff barriers have been either removed or reduced. It's been easier for foreign investment to circulate, so not distinguishing between foreign and domestic capital, opening the gates for markets to form. And particularly, this is also in the context of the proliferation of multinational enterprises, which have a kind of global reach. So in that sense, states are not in control of global commodity prices. So if you're adopting an extractive development strategy that's premised on integrating into global minerals markets, for instance, the state has to encounter, the state is not able to contain some of the economic effects of that strategy. And then in that sense, investor relationships, so the state's relationship with global market actors, so foreign investors, lenders, credit ratings agencies, those relationships become very primary and very important for the state, because then it's not just a case of the state managing a national extractive industry with its local population. It has to deal with the perception of legitimacy around how it's being how the sector is being governed from these external market actors. So what's really interesting in the context of the globalization of the economy in general is that the role of the state has been redefined and rearticulated in terms of its ability to manage market dynamics, so to make sure that national development is planned in line with commodity cycles so that it doesn't create kind of a bust scenario where the state then has no income and is spiraling. So the state role is largely conceived in terms of influence, management, and regulation, rather than state control. And so that's a really important differentiation. And it's important because that discourse of influence and management and being a good manager of markets can sometimes conflict with public expectations that the state is the ultimate sovereign, that it can control what's happening in its territory. So sometimes there's a conflict then between the domestic constituents of the state, the voters, and those who are relying on the state to provide an attractive environment for them to invest. So you can see how the conflict can play out. Okay, so now that sorry, I just don't want to go over time, so I'm trying to move along fairly quickly. So now that I've set up the background framework, so we can see this interrelationship between economic development and the state, and particularly how those dynamics are exacerbated in the context of extractive development and also in the context of economic globalization. So now we've set up the context, we can turn to Mongolia. So how is Mongolia being caught up in these specific dynamics around development and state change? So if we return to Mongolia's experience, as we all know, this is a history I'm sure, are all aware of. In the early 1990s, there was a significant political and economic upheaval, which led to the democratization of the political system. So the state became sensitized in a way that it hadn't been in the past to the views of its citizens. And also the economy was marketized. So the economy became sensitized to the global economic environment. So there are these twin processes of change, which kind of are the backdrop for what's happened since in relation to the mining sector. In particularly, when it comes to the marketization of the economy, Mongolia was lauded in the 1990s for its embrace of free market reforms as part of structural adjustment packages offered by international financial institutions. But interestingly, Mongolia's constitution, if we look at the text, actually embodies a compromise around to what extent the state should promote market-led development or should still have some kind of role in articulating a more national account of development. So Article 5, Section 1 of the 1992 Constitution is quite illuminating. It says, Mongolia shall have an economy based on different forms of property, which takes into account universal trends of world economic development, as well as national specifics. So what we're seeing here, if you read between the lines, different forms of property. So that means that they're going to recognize, the government will recognize private property, which is the basis of a market economy. At the same time, there's this balancing between universal trends, so global capitalism, and national specifics. So they're keeping it open in terms of what role the state will take in the economy. And if we look into the context of that particular legal text, that reflects very much a political compromise in the early 1990s between free market reformers and those that were keen to preserve a sense of state control of the economy reminiscent of the socialist period. So the Constitution is embodying that tension, that political tension at the time. So it's in this context, in the late 1990s, that we see the adoption of a new development strategy. So because Mongolia embraced the free market and opened up and liberalized its economy, a lot of the industry that had been built up really fell without Soviet support or through privatization. So the key question facing Mongolian policymakers was, on what basis can Mongolia be competitive in the global economy that we're now in? So there were two primary sectors, so cashmere and minerals. And advised also by the World Bank and other development organizations, Mongolia decided to pursue exploration of its vast mineral wealth, some of which had been exploited during the socialist period, but largely had been untapped. So this was seen as a way that Mongolia could quickly get out of the kind of the economic spiral it was caught in the post-socialist period. And in a sense, we can see that the 1997 minerals law particularly was a way of signaling in the global market that Mongolia was open for business. So the World Bank has helped Mongolian policymakers and legislators to draft the 1997 minerals law, and it was widely seen internationally as one of the most competitive frameworks. It was low taxation, ease of access to mining licenses, it was first come, first served basis, and there was no real screening of investment, and it was very easy to participate, even with a small amount of capital, in this new mining frontier. Crucially, though, in this period, we can see that the state, because of the post-socialist transition, really withdrew from the rural economy. So the pastoral economy that had been supported by the collectives in the socialist period were either privatized or were dismantled. And there was a sense that the state had evacuated from real governance of the rural economy. So it's in that context that then the 1997 minerals law is introduced, where mining licenses are essentially being given out pretty freely, and we have a wave of unregulated mining now impacting the rural economy. And so these centralized licenses essentially showing up and saying, we have a license, we're here to mine, or we're here to explore. So as you can imagine, the social and environmental impacts, as well as the sense of, we didn't say yes to this is all a centralized process, led to some pretty robust critiques of mining as a development strategy, and a real concern that the communities that are most impacted by mining in rural areas were really not getting the benefits. So we have this wave of questioning the legitimacy of the extractive development strategy, and that was reflected in the rise of rural social movements that were contesting contesting the way mining was so unregulated. At the same time, in the early 2000s, the significant Oyu-Tolgoi deposits were discovered. So you can imagine, being a policymaker at the time, that you could see a way out of the rising legitimacy crisis. So there's a sense in which Mongolia has this incredible wealth that's been discovered. The public are pushing for the state to take a stronger hand, to experience more of the redistributive impacts, to actually benefit more from the sector, and for the state to take a stronger hand in regulation. So all of this tension culminated in changes in 2006 with the introduction of a new minerals law. So this wasn't a reform of the 1997 law, it was the introduction of a brand new law. And we can see it as a legislative response to the legitimacy crisis, as well as the recognition of an opportunity for the state to gain more control of these significant national deposits. Interestingly, if we could say that the 1997 minerals law was kind of in line with universal trends of world economic development, the 2006 law articulates a sense of national specifics. So within a broadly market-oriented pro-investment framework, the idea was that the state should participate actively in the market. They could hold direct shares in mining projects, and this actually gave the state then the right to negotiate for a 34% stake in the Oyu-Tolgoi mining project. So the timing isn't an accident, it's really in response to these, changes. So the windfall profits tax in 2006 was also introduced. So that was a tax where after global commodity prices reached a certain level in copper and gold, the government could tax 68%. So this was another way in which we see national specifics, national interest in revenue being articulated. Notably, this expectation that the government would be able to take control of the mining sector led to the development of a very ambitious new development strategy that Mongolia could progress very quickly away from lower income status towards being a middle income country, with extractive development being seen as a stepping stone towards creating more value added products and moving away from exporting primary commodities towards a more tertiary knowledge-based economy. And importantly, so there's a sense at this moment that the new law, the sense of the government taking a stronger hand, was going to inform a much more redistributive development approach. All of this culminated in the final signing of the Untitled Investment Agreement in 2009 after much negotiation. So it wasn't a straightforward time. At the same time, there was a sense of optimism, I think, particularly among the public, that actually extractive development could work if the state took a stronger role. Obviously, foreign investors didn't perceive the 2006 changes very positively. There was a sense that, oh no, we're getting, this is signaling maybe some resource nationalism, the state taking control of the sector. At the same time, the reforms weren't too dramatic. So apart from the windfall profits tax, the 2006 law was fairly balanced. It was still a pretty competitive framework. However, as global commodity prices were booming, there was also a boom in national legislation between 2009 and 2012. And this period is what's often referred to quite pejoratively by foreign investors and in the international media as kind of the period of resource nationalist politics, which you're probably already quite familiar with. So two key laws were passed: the law on the prohibition of mineral exploration and mining operations, the law with a long name. So this was the subject of great lobbying and advocacy by environmental movements very early on in the 2000s, and was finally passed in 2009. And it gave extensive discretionary power to subnational governments to determine environmental boundaries. So from a market perspective, foreign investors are quite wary of anything that gives too much discretionary power to regulators and to governments. So in a sense, it was particularly the case because there was largely a sense that local governments had been a bit of a thorn in mining companies' side, and that this was going to empower them to make decisions that weren't conducive to mining operations. So there was a concern about that from the market side. Another law that was passed, which was very controversial, is the Strategic Entities Foreign Investment Law, which gave extensive powers to both Parliament and Cabinet to screen investment, to make shareholder disclosure mandatory and obligatory, and also to review the board appointments of companies. So there was a real sense with both of these laws that the state is taking on some very discretionary power that could really impact the security and the stability of the investment environment. This all really came to a head in 2011 as well, with the attempted renegotiation of the Untitled Investment Agreement. So what that signaled to foreign investors was that the state was not committed to the rule of law, at least that was the discourse, that the state didn't respect the sanctity of contracts. And so there was a real sense now of real concern about the state taking control of the sector. Notably, also the law with a long name, just to add this in, the law with a long name was actually not implemented until 2011. The government obviously felt quite concerned because it would lead to the cancellation of mining licenses. The Supreme Court forced the implementation in 2011, or mandated it. And what that led to was the cancellation of 200 mining licenses, affecting 1,800 projects. So you can see there's a real spiral here of seeming, that, or at least appearing to be, that the national government, or the national state is taking a lot more control of the sector, and also not abiding by market norms for state behavior in terms of being a good manager and a good regulator and respecting market definitions of the rule of law. Okay, so it's in this context that we see a dramatic decline in investment. This is largely due to declining commodity prices, but the interpretation of the events around the drop in investment is that the government had behaved in a resource nationalist way, that there had been the stability of the investment environment had been threatened, and that essentially there was a a convergence of declining confidence and declining capital. And so, in a sense, it was bad timing for the Mongolian government to have pursued those resource nationalist policies, as some have argued. Importantly, though, we see a very direct change in response to this investment crisis. So we could see that the state was becoming more heavy-handed, if you like, in relation to the mining regime, re-articulating a sense of national specifics, and also national regulatory goals. So really responding to public concerns about the role of China in mining investment, especially CFIL, the Strategic Entities Foreign Investment Law, was largely in response to concern about Chinese takeover of certain resources, but through buying mining licenses through mining licenses, and also in responding to concerns about environmental regulation. So we can see that the state was responding to a public legitimacy crisis about geopolitical and environmental concerns, but what happened through those policies is that a different legitimacy crisis was triggered, where market constituents, investors, development banks, credit ratings agencies suddenly said, "Oh, Mongolia's overstepped here. They've crossed the line." So what happened in 2013 is foreign direct investment really began to spiral. It already actually started in 2012, but between 2013 and 2014, we see a dramatic drop in investment, really spiraling, dropping 64%, and continuing to spiral from there. Very quickly, because, and this is what I mean when I said that economic development, or anything really related to the economy, strikes at the heart of the state, is that the state was thinking, well, the state doesn't really think, but you know what I mean. There was a sense in which this is provoking an absolute crisis because our source of revenue is being cut off. And the government had taken on a number of debts, loans, and bonds in order to fund infrastructure development. So there was a real sense of we're not going to be able to make our payments. So there was a sense of an impending debt crisis, which did occur, as you all know. So in this context, there was a direct turnaround from the kind of nationalist, I say that in quotation marks because it was a constructed discourse, but the nationalist politics of 2009 to 2012, we see in 2013 and 2014 a total reversal in terms of the state's approach. So also in conjunction with the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, the 2013 investment law was quite quickly put together at the end of 2013, which was really designed to resurrect foreign direct investment. And I just want to highlight some of the text of that law. Article 1 is very clear in terms of the intention of the law, is to protect the legal rights and interests of investors in the territory of Mongolia, to establish a common legislative guarantee for investment, to encourage investment, to stabilize the tax environment, to determine the rights and obligations of investors and the competences of a government body related to investment. So what we're seeing in this law is a re-articulation of the balance between the state and the market, and that was what it was intended to do, was to create a sense of stability about what the state's role is in relation to mining investment. Importantly, this law was also protected by new quorum measures. So instead of being able to be easily changed, there was this perception that Parliament in particular had been really behind the resource nationalist politics and had been creating lots of controversial legislation. And so the investment law was protected by a new quorum measure where you had to have a 2/3 majority to change the law. So we can see in the entrenchment, the immediate entrenchment of this law in order to create and remind foreign investors that the state is committed to a stable investment environment. Very shortly after the new investment law was passed, a new state policy on minerals was passed with 90% majority in the Ikhorl. So that state policy, again, really articulates in Article 1.2 the goal to create a stable investment environment and to strengthen competitiveness in the global market. Now that state policy really provided a rationale and a framework for consequent changes to the Minerals Code, which very importantly made it much easier again to get licenses, reduced screening measures, as well as reducing restrictions on license trading, which had been one of the key issues around CFIL. And also around this time, the environmental law that was so controversial was revised, so in line with this new commitment to stability. So this is a very kind of a quick overview of a very complex political situation, which I'm sure all of you are very aware of. But since 2014, I want to argue that we see a shift in the state. So the kind of compromise that was articulated in the 1992 Constitution, this question about what's the state's role going to be in the economy, was clarified through this almost constitutional crucible of an investment crisis, which led the state to realize or recognize a sense of a limit to what it could pursue in the name of national specifics or national interests. So since 2014, mining law and policy have really been premised on a return to emphasis on private sector-led development, the state being a manager and a regulator, and recommitment to market principles and rules. So not discriminating between foreign and domestic investment, not screening investment, and really shifting that political discourse of resource nationalism. Notably, part of the 2014 shift in terms of the policy framework was about designating competent state bodies for decision-making in relation to mining. There was a real sense of concern that local hurls in IMEX and SUMS, as well as Parliament, had been a vocal source of nationalism, partly because they're the direct links with the public in terms of voting. So since 2014, we see a shift where increasingly it is ministries and agencies which are responsible for governing and managing the relationships with investors. And we see, particularly with the quorum measures and entrenchment of the investment law, kind of trying to reduce the role of Parliament in terms of affecting investment relationships. And obviously that makes sense if there's a perception that we caused this crisis because of our nationalism. While that may not be wholly true in the sense that there's also the global commodity cycles to think about, that was very much the discourse at the time. So to really understand and unpack the dramatic turnaround in terms of the state's approach to regulating the mining sector, I argue that we need to understand the question of economic development as deeply entangled with issues of state formation. So the state's economic dependency on global markets and on maintaining those global external relationships reveals that the state is not just constituted, as it says on paper, by the national constituency. There is a transnational constituency that affects very much the policies that can be legitimately pursued. And while you might want to argue pragmatically that that's necessary if we're going to pursue a market development strategy, it does raise lots of questions about how complementary is that with what the Constitution says on paper. So the new accumulation strategy based on integrating competitively in global minerals markets introduces a new source of legitimacy, a transnational source of legitimacy from these external constituents, as I would call them. So investors, mining companies, international financial institutions, they all have strong views that are largely consonant with each other about how the state should regulate the Mongolia's mining sector. And we can really see the influence of these voices, particularly following the investment crisis. And we can see also the construction of this transnational narrative about the role of the state, to which in some senses it was very difficult to challenge from a national context. So if the international media is saturated with a particular narrative, that's very difficult to challenge in that sense. And so we could argue that on paper and in some extent in practice, the Mongolian state is still a unitary state. It's got, it's democratic separation of powers, the executive, the judiciary, the legislature. So in that sense, the form looks the same. It's still a national state. There hasn't been any kind of takeover or conspiracy. This national state is still alive and well. But what we're seeing, if we think about the ensemble metaphor, is a different song being played by the ensemble, and particularly particular actors within the ensemble, particularly executive institutions, taking a very strong role in determining what this relationship is going to be like and squeezing out, to some degree, the voice of the legislature and representative institutions. In practice, we can see that the state's regulatory options, in a context like Mongolia where there's dependency on foreign investment, these options are fairly limited. And I think that reality was really brought home. And I think this is where we talk about economic globalization and economic development, but we need to understand that this has very direct political and legal implications for regulation and governance. So to return to the initial question that I posed in the title of my talk, the state has forgotten its reason for being, ? It's a tricky one to answer. You could say that in one sense, yes and no. So it's tricky because integrating in the global minerals economy has raised complex legitimation issues for the state. And this is not to justify, I know if you read the media, there's a constant criticism of the Mongolian government and the Mongolian state. And I'm not trying to, in a sense, justify decisions that have been made. But I think we need to understand sociologically that integrating in the global minerals sector changes the state's responsiveness to different actors. So many citizens are dissatisfied with the state's performance. So there's a sense in, why can't the state control the economy? Why are we in a debt crisis? Why does the cost of, bread and eggs and milk, keep going up? Why aren't we benefiting from our natural resources as we were promised? And then there's still concern from the private sector that the state isn't liberal enough, that it's not pursuing good governance sufficiently, that it should make it even easier for corporations to access mining licenses. So in a sense, the state can't win in this context, and therefore becomes a very vulnerable target to saying this is a context of state failure, this is a narrative of a nationalist state, and that really plays into a discourse about what the state's regulatory role is and should be. So essentially, I want to argue that we need to step back a little bit and understand how the state is trying to balance new and old legitimacy dynamics. So the state is still responsive to the public, and we can see that in the way politicians are, in their platforms. And there's still a sense that the state is responsible for redistribution. So it's not that the old dynamics have gone away in terms of the state-citizenship relationship. There's just a whole new layer of relations that the state is having to manage, for better or for worse. And some would say, things have improved actually. So it's not really about making a judgment necessarily in terms of, some people would say, well, this is, being under the scrutiny of international investors has made the state more open, less corrupt, or, I don't know, you could make those arguments. But it's not really about making a moral judgment. It's about understanding the actual dynamics that are affecting governance. And then I think it raises more normative questions. Once we understand the picture of actually what governance dynamics the state's facing when it pursues extractive development, then that helps us to ask different kinds of questions. So in a sense, that's really my contribution, is not, it is a history you're all familiar with, but it raises very basic questions, actually, this history. To whom is the state primarily responsive and responsible? So is it to the Mongolian public? Is it to its external constituents? Probably both. But how does that actually balance out when the rubber hits the road? When there's an investment crisis, what happens? To what degree is the state's apparently sovereign policy space actually constrained in practice by the global market environment? And is that a problem? So some would say it's fine. That's actually a good thing because markets are linked with democracy, and we don't want states having too much control. We want there to be an open economy. So if that's your point of view, you might actually want there to be some limitation of policy space. So you could make that argument. But it does raise the question about what we say about how the state is constituted on paper and what happens in practice. So if the Constitution says that the state has the right to regulate in a nationally specific way, does it practically have, it has the right on paper, but it doesn't have the right in practice. And equally, in another kind of socio-legal sense, how are these competing regulatory preferences embodied in governance frameworks? How does the state try to seek to maintain legitimacy with the public and also with the private sector? So these are just questions that are really thrown up, I think. by this connecting questions of state formation and economic development. So just to conclude, I want to say that extractive development is really not just an economic strategy. Often development is kind of hidden. The actual processes of development are hidden in economic terms. So we think, oh, everything can go on just fine in terms of the political system. But then we wonder, why are these things so political? It's because they are political. The deeply political choices about how economies are organized. So in some ways, we've had the opportunity to see just how political these dynamics are in Mongolia because it's a democracy. It's not a failure that it's been political in Mongolia in that sense. It's been political because this is the nature of the issue that's at stake. And so I want to argue at the end of this talk for a return to recognizing the importance and value of politics and not opting for a depoliticizing, technocratic, we just need to return to economic management. That is a question. Economic management is important. But because of the significance of this development strategy for the whole Mongolian nation, there's a reason why it's political, and I think that matters. I saw an Asian Barometer survey in 2016 that highlighted how there's an increase of support for more authoritarian governments in Mongolia, up from 40% in 2001 to 64% in 2016. I think what that indicates is there's a sense of failure that the state maybe hasn't managed the market well. The state hasn't also delivered on its nationalist promises, and so there's a sense in which there's maybe a preference for more of a strong state model where we don't have these kind of political disruptions, these difficult legal dramas and regulatory politics. And I just want to say on an ending note that actually those dynamics would still be there. They would just be hidden in an authoritarian context, and that there's value in the way that Mongolia as a democracy has illuminated this reality. And I hope that that in the future there can be real engagement with these deeper questions. So I'm now open to questions, so thank you very much.